In the year 1347, a shadow fell across Europe. A silent, invisible enemy, carried by fleas on rats, began an indiscriminate march of death. It was the Black Death, a plague so devastating it would wipe out nearly half of the continent's population. Up to 200 million lives extinguished in just a few agonizing years. A catastrophe of unimaginable scale. But what if this cataclysm had never occurred? What if those 200 million people had lived? The answer, surprisingly, is that our modern world, the one we inhabit today, might never have come to be. Imagine a different 14th century. The plague ships from Crimea arrive, but the disease fizzles out, contained, or simply never manifests with such virulence. Europe breathes a collective sigh of relief. The medieval world continues, seemingly untouched. But beneath this calm surface lies a deeper truth. Before the Black Death, Europe was already struggling. Its population had swelled dramatically since the 11th century, pushing the limits of available resources. Famine was a recurring specter. Land was scarce, jobs were few, and the existing feudal system was already groaning under the strain. Without the Black Death, these underlying tensions wouldn't disappear. They would intensify, locking Europe into a much longer, darker age. Without the devastating population crash, the medieval feudal system would have remained entrenched. Think about it. The Black Death created a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, surviving peasants were in high demand. Their value skyrocketed. Lords were forced to offer better wages, better living conditions, and even freedom, just to keep their fields working. This shift fundamentally weakened the power of the landed aristocracy and slowly eroded the system of serfdom that had defined Europe for centuries. But in our alternate timeline, the population remains high. There's no shortage of hands to work the fields. The peasant class remains a vast, easily replaceable workforce, with little leverage, little freedom, and no upward mobility. They are tied to the land, generation after generation, their lives dictated by the whims of their lords. The Malthusian trap, where population growth outstrips food supply, would tighten its grip. Famine would become more widespread, more frequent, and more brutal, continually culling the population in a slower, more agonizing way than the plague ever could. Without the sudden shock to the labor market, the economic incentives for change simply vanish. The economic stagnation extends far beyond the fields. With an abundance of cheap labor, there is little to no incentive for technological innovation. Why invest in new, complex machines when human hands are plentiful and cost next to nothing? The agricultural tools of the 14th century would remain largely unchanged for centuries. Farming practices would not evolve significantly. This means less food per acre, less surplus, and less wealth circulating in the economy. The burgeoning merchant class, which was slowly gaining power before the plague, would find its growth stifled. There's less demand for goods, less capital for investment, and fewer opportunities for trade. Cities, instead of becoming centers of commerce and new ideas, would remain overcrowded, unsanitary hubs of poverty and disease. Without the Black Death, the pressure to find more efficient ways of doing things, to innovate, simply isn't there. The seeds of the Industrial Revolution, sown centuries later, would never find fertile ground. Perhaps the most profound impact would be on the intellectual and social landscape. The massive death toll of the Black Death shook the foundations of medieval society, including the unquestioned authority of the Church. People questioned divine justice, leading to new philosophical inquiries and a more critical view of established institutions. The scarcity of educated priests and scholars after the plague also opened doors for new thinkers and new ideas. This intellectual ferment, coupled with the new wealth of the merchant class, directly fueled the Renaissance. Artists, scientists, humanists, all found patronage and freedom to explore. But in our plague-free world, the Church's dominance remains unchallenged. Universities continue to be bastions of conservative theology. There is no Renaissance, no explosion of art, science, and humanism. There is no Reformation, as the grievances against the Church are never strong enough to coalesce into a widespread movement. Without the demographic pressure and new economic opportunities, the age of exploration might never have truly begun. Why seek new lands when there's no surplus population to send, no new markets truly needed, and no desperate search for wealth to break free from feudal constraints? Europe remains inward-looking, bound by tradition and scarcity. The long-term geopolitical consequences would be immense. A Europe trapped in extended feudalism, battling perpetual famine and social unrest, would be a much weaker and less dynamic continent. Its states would be less able to project power outwards. While Europe stagnates, other civilizations, like the Ottoman Empire or the powerful Ming dynasty in China, might continue to flourish and expand their influence unchecked. The global balance of power would be drastically different. There would be no European colonial empires as we know them. No transatlantic slave trade on the same scale. The Americas might have remained untouched for centuries longer, or perhaps colonized by different powers entirely. The very fabric of global interconnectedness, shaped so profoundly by European expansion, would be utterly unrecognizable. Our modern world, defined by scientific advancement, individual liberty, and global trade, would be a distant, impossible dream, lost in the shadow of an unending medieval era.